I'm Chase Untermeyer, a professor of practice here at the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. And this is my inaugural effort at hosting this monthly program of interviews with interesting and active guests in the world of public affairs. And I couldn't be happier to have as the first guest on this program for me, Dr. Luke Nichter, a distinguished professor of history at Chapman University in California, who is a specialist in all things presidential and related to American politics. If I can just try to compress Dr. Nichter's life in a few moments here, he is a noted expert in particular on Richard Nixon's 3,432 hours of secret White House tapes. And he is a New York Times bestselling author and editor of seven books, including Richard Nixon and Europe, The Reshaping of the Post-War Atlantic World. His area of specialty is the Cold War, the modern presidency, and US and diplomatic history, with a focus on that period between the time of John F. Kennedy and Watergate. Dr. Nichter earned his PhD in history from Bowling Green State University, and he lives now in Orange, California, and Bowling Green, Ohio. So welcome to Dr. Nichter for this an inaugural program for me. So please be gentle, and we are happy to have you.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I didn't realize it was the inaugural, so maybe after this first one, you'll might change course.
Not a bit, not a bit. Well, just to find out a bit about you, were you always interested in history, and what path led you to where you are now?
I was a late bloomer, and I don't hide that fact. I grew up in a real, I call it a blue collar working class family in Northwest Ohio in the Rust Belt, amidst cornfields, and I have parents who were union members, but I was a first generation college grad, and really I don't recall any real political talk growing up. This was, I think, in our modern red-blue election maps, Ohio was considered a purple state, and I grew up in a purple county in a purple state. So I don't recall ever being around any kind of partisan or extreme views of any kind. My undergraduate degree was actually more in economics and business, and probably when I got into my 20s, and as I think as a lot of people do, you start to pay taxes. You might get married, you might have kids, and those kids might be in public school, and you sort of you begin to become more inquisitive about how we got to where we are in society. And so it's really in my 20s, I really developed an intense interest in history and knowing more about how we got here. And I think, I guess it's a pithy statement, but I guess the rest is history.
So you grew up in the state that's called the mother of presidents, but you're telling me that you never cracked a book about American history when you were a kid?
We a mother of presidents, but that's also disputed, I think, by Virginia and some others who have a claim to that. And these are also, of course, primarily 19th century, fairly anonymous presidents. I recall as a kid, nearby me was Fremont, Ohio, where I grew up in Wood County, and Fremont's just, the next county over, where the Rutherford B Hayes Presidential Library and House is the very first in the system that would become this presidential library system, still operating well today. And so, I guess you could look back. I don't try to go beyond my professional training and put myself on the couch, but if I were for a moment, I suppose you would say the seeds were planted at a young age. It's in the bloodline, or it's in the water, perhaps. Certainly it's in the soil in Ohio that produced, as you say, so many leaders. And, family vacations were typically, if there was a vacation, it was tent camping, mosquito bites, and visits to places like Civil War battlefields. Smoky Mountains were an easy trip. So I think history and, are more the idea of history and the appreciation of history, I think, was a value growing up. But I think in terms of formal training, you can't look at my background and point to much, at least in the younger years.
Well, you mentioned Rutherford B Hayes, who indeed is one of the more obscure presidents. He was one of those who looked like he came off the box of Smith Brothers cough drops, a heavily bearded fellow who people don't remember, except in one country, he is the most famous American president. Perhaps you know that in Paraguay, he is to this very day still lauded for his effort to mediate the end of a very bloody war that Paraguay instituted against its neighbors. And there is even a city in Paraguay named for him, which they pronounce Hages instead of Hayes. But that's my contribution to presidential trivia today.
Perhaps one day, if bilateral relations between the US and Paraguay sink to some low, there's some Hayes descendant who can mitigate the dispute.
Please let us know about him. So what led you, once you finally did get bitten by the history bug, to the period that you concentrate on now?
Well, I think it's advice I pass on to my students today, and it's the advice I got back then. I think often in history, that it's the journalists who write the first draft of history because they're the ones covering the events at the time, in the moment. And then, the political scientists come along, and the social scientists, the economists come along a few years later. And then it's really historians who do kind of the mopping up job. 30 to 50 years later, probably after interest is often lost by a lot of people, but that's really when the records become declassified and available in archives. And so it's brand new to historians and exciting, might be 50 years old to everyone else. And for my students, as ancient to them as Abraham Lincoln is, and as relevant to their daily lives. So the advice I got was, look at, I was in desperate need for as all grad students are, for a thesis topic, a dissertation topic. I hope to get that done, graduate, get a job, begin a career. And so I was advised to look along what they call the archival frontier, look at what's being newly released in the archives. And this was back in the very early years of this century. So rewinding the clock 30 to 50 years puts you right in kind of the late 1960s, early 1970s. And really with all the books that were already in existence then, Nixon, Kissinger, Vietnam, China, Soviet Union, Watergate, it didn't seem like there was anything left to learn. But once I began to make friends with archivists and learn that actually, a lot is being declassified, the Nixon tapes were just beginning to be released. And we still have today 500 more hours of those that have never been released, even as of now. I realized, actually, no, there could be something here worth doing. It became just a matter of choosing kind of what was new. And so for me, it became US-European relations or transatlantic relations during the Nixon years, which became in edited form that first book that you mentioned in the intro.
Well, your next book, I'm told, is on the 1968 presidential election, which was won by Richard Nixon. And we'll get to him in a moment. But tell us about that ancient year of 1968, which isn't quite so ancient to someone my age. I happen to have graduated from college in 1968, and I remember it extremely well as one of the most tumultuous, amazing, exciting, and difficult years in American history. So for the benefit of those people, possibly even including yourself, who don't remember it as vividly, tell us about that year and why it stands out.
Yeah, I think my interest in 68 is when we were at the 50th anniversary a few years ago, as often happens in US history, we have a fresh look on certain anniversaries at years past. And so I really assumed that there would be not even just one, but numerous books that take a look at that year with the hindsight of 50 years. But the anniversary really sort of came and went quietly without a lot of any fresh insight or analysis, despite the fact that, I think an argument can be made that the divisions of that year perhaps more closely resemble the divisions in the country today and the culture wars of today, if I can use that term, than perhaps any other year in modern history. And so really one thing led to another. I'm skipping over some details, but what I'm trying to do is really, and I was born in 1977. So I write this, I think an asset, but also a liability for someone like me. It's an asset because I wasn't in the war, I wasn't drafted, I wasn't on a campus, I wasn't seared by the events of that decade. It's a liability because I have a lot to learn, and that things for people who, a lot of names and events for people who live through them are still, household names with a little bit of refreshing of a memory. And for me, I've had a lot of reading and learning to do about that. Someone who born years afterward, my parents were only reaching were in high school, that time period. And so one thing led to another, and I think I might be the craziest person to try to get cooperation and try to interview everybody left from that campaign. And I'm really proud to say that no matter what the book looks like that results, and we're about a year out from its publication still, it's going through editing now. I've managed to get cooperation from the four major sides. So President Lyndon Johnson, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, former Vice President Richard Nixon at the time, and former Alabama Governor George Wallace. And I've interviewed 85 or 90 to date, all the remaining staffers, all of the kids. I mean, they're not kids anymore. And I think have got a lot of new things to say, as well as a lot of new archival records that haven't been used before, that have just become released because with the passage of time, a lot of people are no longer with us and they've left behind treasure troves of records. So I think I'm going to have something new to say about that year.
Well, leave it to me as somebody who was around in those days to give a very brief chronology that 1968 started with the seizure of the U.S. naval vessel, the Pueblo, by North Korea, and American sailors and officers were held in pretty awful conditions in that country for about a year. That was followed by the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, and it was followed by Lyndon Johnson taking himself out of the presidential race. That was about the time or not long after he was stunned by the candidacy of Eugene McCarthy, challenging him in the Democratic primary in New Hampshire, which Johnson won. But McCarthy coming in so strongly as he did shook the foundations of the Johnson effort, which led to his dropping out, and then Robert Kennedy dropping in. We advanced the tape. There are the assassinations of Martin Luther King and of Robert Kennedy. There were American cities ablaze. There was later in that summer, the infamous, notorious Democratic Convention in Chicago with rioting in the streets, leading to the so-called Chicago 7 trial, which I guess took place the next year. And then on to the tumultuous end, which was the presidential election. So I may have left out some things, but what would you say about that year, 1968, that makes you think about our time?
Well, I mean, first of all, my reaction is that's a pretty good list. I think you might be reading from my manuscript. In the draft introduction, I lay out a very similar list to kind of set the scene. And I think the only things I say that weren't mentioned already were that Nixon completed one of the greatest political comebacks in certainly modern U.S. history, if not all of U.S. history. I mean, really coming back, resurrecting himself from a close loss in 1960, a more decisive and humiliating loss in 1962. And then in the fall, really the desperate effort to obtain some kind of a peace agreement or negotiate these really the beginning of serious peace negotiations between the United States and North Vietnam in the fall, capped by a very close election and an 11th hour October surprise of a bombing halt. So I think, there are several themes that resonate. I think when you look at the country today, and I think a lot of history is written for the present. There's a theme that goes on today, and we want to know more, and we want to look for context of what did we do before. And so I don't think history repeats itself all the time or even necessarily rhymes. But I think when you look at how divided the country is. It seems like every 4 years, the media reminds us that we've never been divided any more than we are at that moment. And I think that can go too far. The first college class I taught was in 2004. And I remember distinctly in the race between George W. Bush and John Kerry, the media saying that then. And the freshmen in my US history survey class said, weren't we more divided during the 1860s? And weren't we more divided even during the 1960s? And, I remember one of the Nixon officials I got to know early on, I think I was still in grad school, was Nixon's chief speechwriter, Ray Price. And Ray Price said, his view was always, he was kind of I would call him a liberal New York Republican. He was he came from the New York Herald Tribune before working for Nixon. And he was editor of its editorial page. And in 1964, he wrote the Herald Tribune's endorsement of Lyndon Johnson, the first time the Tribune had endorsed a Democrat. And so I think he's very interesting as a centrist. He has lots of ideas that go beyond the talking points of a political party. But one of the things he said to me was, he always believed, and others around him in the White House believed, that if the 1860s were an actual civil war, the 1960s were a proxy civil war. And when you take a look at the divisions in the country, you take a look at violence in our cities, you take a look at issues related to police violence and brutality. When you take a look at an unpopular war, when you take a look at, there's something different about this generation. And in 1968, it was young people against their parents. It was young people against the establishment. And I think every once in a while in US history, maybe every generation or two, we have, there's something different going on with the next generation. And, we might look back at this time period today, some decades from now with hindsight, and say that something interesting is going on now too, perhaps. And all of the 20th century, you look at kind of a cultural, social explosion and a really self-examination of what we stand for. And I think you've got to look at the 1960s. You've got to look at the 1920s, perhaps. And I think you look at more recent times, and we'll make sense of that in the coming years. So I think there's a lot of themes and subjects that have direct relevance to what's going on today, even if the specific issues can be different. A lot of the problems are still with us.
Well, to talk about the 1968 election, which we will in some detail in a moment, I guess it's necessary to remind people what happened in 1964. Why was it a historic Republican newspaper like the old Herald Tribune considered it historic to endorse a Democrat for president?
I try to always remind my students, as much as we're all conditioned to think with the knowledge that we have in 2022, you've got to try to think in the moment, when you have bring the right context into the conversation. In 1964 was one of the four great landslide elections of the 20th century, 2 Republican, 2 Democratic. So you have 1936 with FDR, you've got Johnson over Goldwater in 64, Nixon over McGovern in 72, and then of course Reagan in 84. But in 64, it was, the way I teach this in my class, I'm teaching a class right now called The Age of Richard Nixon, kind of a sophomore level undergraduate class, as much about the age, and modern US history as it is about Nixon, and kind of, tracing his career through these events in US history. And, the way I describe it to my students is, I think each party, Democrats and Republicans, is divided between, the terms can inform but also confuse us, but let's call them, populists and, a more activist wing in both sides. And every once in a while, I think a party, the activist wing, really kind of takes hold and gets what they want. And so Republicans in 1964, I think, had waged a very long battle, conservative Republicans, at actually nominating what they consider to be a real conservative. And if you look at, I think all the way back to Dewey, Dewey was a liberal, the way they saw it, New York Republican Governor Thomas Dewey. Then you had for conservatives, Eisenhower wasn't really a real Republican. They wanted Taft, Bob Taft from Ohio. Nixon was kind of a compromise, but Lodge made it even worse, being his running mate in 60. And so 64, the few Goldwater Republicans that are left, and there are some left, when you talk to them today, and I do, they look back on 64 not as one of the most lopsided losses, but as a victory, because they finally beat the populist internationalist side of the party and nominated one of their own. Well, that's a pretty tough road to the White House in terms of just having the numbers on your side. And so Johnson kind of, being part of kind of the big center left, was able to command not just control of the Democratic Party, but people on both sides of the big center in politics. And at the Republican convention in San Francisco at the Cow Palace, you had a lot of moderate to liberal Republicans, leave in protest even before the convention was over. Henry Cabot Lodge, returning as ambassador from Saigon, was one of those, and he was asked on the way out, what are you doing? And he said, he said something like, I'm going to go home to Beverly, Massachusetts, on the North Shore in Boston. And I'm going to row out in my boat and think a while. And I think that's what, Republicans on the liberal moderate side did. Rockefeller was in the same situation, refused to wear a Goldwater button. So it was one of those campaigns where, it happens every once in a while to both parties, where kind of the insurgents, if you want to use that title, really get their way. And when you do, it becomes very difficult to win an election. And I think that explains Johnson's lopsided win.
And for the benefit of anybody who doesn't know, we're talking about Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona, who was the conservative leader in between Robert Taft, you mentioned, who lost Eisenhower, and the coming of Ronald Reagan. So Republicans under Goldwater suffered this massive defeat in 1964. So what happens over the next few years to make it possible for them to win with Richard Nixon just the next election?
Well, from the records that I see in the archives, and I think this happens today. I think Democrats, their more activist wing is really pressing the case to see more nominees, more candidates, sort of in their image. In 2020, they ultimately backed down and went with someone who was much more of a compromise in Joe Biden. But so I think this does repeat itself, and 64 to 68. I think it's that conversation that takes place today in political parties. Do you want to win, and do you want to win, or do you want to remain, call it ideologically pure? And the question is whether the activists win the argument or the pragmatists. And I think too often campaigns are so expensive now. It also depends on what the temperature of the donors is at the moment on the issue. And so leading to 68, I think Nixon out of office in his so-called wilderness years since 1961 had time to think and strategize. I think he always wanted to run again if his odds were good that he could win. And no one had done that. I mean, William Jennings Bryan in history, no one had come back after that many defeats 8 years later and come back to win. So Nixon tried to make the case for the moderates. He had campaigned for Goldwater. I think he might have made more campaign stops for Goldwater in 64 than even Goldwater did. He worked really hard racking up favors among House candidates, Senate candidates, while not specifically endorsing the views or statements of Goldwater, and also not campaigning in the Deep South. So he found a kind of compromise lane to sit in. And I think what really helped Nixon to win the argument with party leaders that you needed to win in 68 by taking a more moderate approach were the 66 midterms, when Nixon predicted big pickups in the House and the Senate and governors, and also in state houses. And the final tallies in November of 66 were almost exactly as he predicted. And it really made Nixon relevant again and kind of established him as being maybe not the leader of the Republican Party, but a Republican Party leader again, a kind of leader of the loyal opposition opposite the Johnson administration. So I think Nixon made the argument that we needed to go back to a pragmatist in order to have a chance to win in 68. And the 66 results proved that there was a chance to do that. And so that, I think that was the political lane that he rode in from 66 through 68.
So to go back to that period, and I recall the 1966 midterms because it was such a huge Republican upsurge. It's the election in which people on the west side of Houston elected a congressman named George Bush, and people out in California elected a governor named Ronald Reagan. It was, in many ways, a very key election. But what happened then between the huge Democratic landslide of 1964 to lead to a Republican upsurge in just 2 years, and then a victory by a Republican candidate for president in 4 years?
Well, I think one thing, when you look at the broad arc of US politics, the pendulum swings back and forth. And when it goes too far in one direction, oftentimes there's a correction coming. And so I think probably without 64, there wouldn't have been a correction in 66. I think probably the final tally for Lyndon Johnson was really represented, went further than I think probably the votes of average Americans would have gone. So I think 66 was kind of a correction to that. And I think you've got a similar situation today, to bring another relevance from this time period to today. I see directly now, I would imagine Republican leaders and Democratic leaders now are figuring out their strategy for 2022 and 2024. And one thing for Republicans today, I think if they overreact, because sometimes you can overreact, if Republicans overreact today, they might get the House and Senate, but then the correction comes in 2024 and they reelect Biden for 4 more years. So I think, anytime that the pendulum swings, there is the inevitable correction. So that's the way that I see 64 and 66. And during that time period, what worked in Nixon's favor was that the chaos of the decade, whether it be the increasingly unpopular war, 60s in Vietnam. 66 is really the first year that Vietnam works against the interests of the Democratic Party, and Johnson's beginning to be criticized by senators like Eugene McCarthy publicly. I think the war, the idea, I think for some that that social progress had gone too far, had become too costly by 66, 67, certainly by 68. I think these other factors also worked in Nixon's favor because he wasn't tied to those unfavorable events. I think Nixon was a way almost for Americans to have time travel back to an earlier period because he wasn't connected to the issues of the 60s because he was out of office. And so I think that was one way is I think Americans ultimately just wanted to turn the noise level down in 1968, whether you were a Republican, whether you were a Democrat. You had issues like the draft in Vietnam that were almost universally despised, except for by some military leaders. So I think Americans ultimately, wanted a choice that allowed them to move beyond the divisive issues of the 1960s. The other context and events worked in Nixon's favor. The desire by Republicans to act to win and to seek a pragmatic nominee also worked in Nixon's favor. I think another factor was Nixon's rivals in 1968, whether it be New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, Michigan Governor George Romney. Really, I think it's a lesson that if you have too much early exposure in a campaign, it's difficult to sustain that later in the campaign, that if you rise too quickly, you're bound to fall. And I think both Rockefeller and Romney kind of flamed out kind of by New Hampshire in 68. And, Nixon, despite his strengths or weaknesses as a candidate, really faced no intense, consistent competition. And he was the only candidate in 68 to run from New Hampshire through Oregon. He did not run in California directly on the ballot because he didn't want to challenge Reagan. So I think that there must have been some kind of an unofficial agreement between the Republican leaders that at some point, Nixon was clearly ahead enough that he was going to have the first chance at the convention. And I think if he had not won on the first ballot at the convention in 68, I think there was in Miami Beach, I think it could have been pretty interesting on a second or, later votes. The media really wanted the dream team of Reagan and Rockefeller. But the challenge there is a lot of their supporters didn't like each other. And so how do you put them together? And I think and who's at the top of the ticket? And I don't think Rockefeller wanted to be anybody's number two. That just wasn't who he was. So I think just for all kinds of reasons, including a lot of them beyond Nixon's control or ability to manage, I think he was the right person at the right time in the right place.
Well, let's talk a bit about Nixon, the man. We'll get back to the election. What can you tell us about that very strange, brilliant, but mystifying personality of Richard Nixon?
Yeah, I think too often today, we put a label on somebody, and it's really difficult to really have a conversation or to ever consider removing the label or modifying it. And I think, especially when the conventional wisdom is established in history, it's very difficult to change that because in history, a lot of the same stories get repeated over and over again. Unfortunately, even in big books, sometimes not a lot of real research or rigorous research or an inquiry takes place. And so, just yesterday in my class, in my other class I'm teaching right now is called White House Tapes from FDR to Nixon. So it's really kind of an applied research class that allows students to be a fly in the wall in the Oval Office between these years of 1940 and 1973. And over, they tell me, I've never taken a history class like this. I can't believe we're listening to these, it's history in the raw and allowing them to come to their own conclusions about things. And so just yesterday and last week and this week, we're on Nixon now at this point in the class, chronological order. And so last week we were playing some tapes that surprised them, shocked them, might even have been repulsive. Whereas this week we're playing tapes about Nixon's grand strategy with China, the Soviet Union, and getting out of the Vietnam War. And so if you only attended class last week, you would think Nixon was a terrible human being. And if you attended class only this week, you might think he's brilliant. I happen to think that they both coexist. And I think that just because someone does bad things, they can do good things. And so I think too often we label someone and it's all or nothing. And I think that's kind of who Nixon was. It was not Nixon people, but a lot of those who work with Lyndon Johnson who have told me over the years, Lyndon Johnson believed to be president, you had to have a killer instinct. And that takes interpretation. I don't think literally they mean end the life of another human being. But when you think of the role of president as commander in chief, you do have to make life and death decisions in a moment's notice with incomplete information before all the facts are in. And sometimes that information conflicts. And so I think and you have to do that in a fairly dispassionate way as you move on to whatever your next pressing challenge is. And so I think, there's been so much emphasis on sort of the dark side, of Nixon. But I think to be president, I think you have to engage with pretty tough foreign adversaries. You have to make pretty cold, callous decisions fairly routinely. And so actually, I think one thing the tapes show us over the longue durée here from FDR to Nixon is while Nixon has gotten a lot of attention for his personality, for four-letter words that he used on tapes, you hear some of the same things from other presidents going all the way back. It's just really been Nixon who's gotten more of this unfavorable attention and light, cast upon him.
Well, Nixon was a very introverted, moody sort of man, and part of that comes out, as you mentioned, in those tapes. How did such a person go into politics, where you have to be extroverted and have to have a sunny disposition? And we think of people like Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan, they just seem natural. And Nixon seems so unnatural.
It's a great question. And I'm not going to pretend to answer it fully or to solve that. I think the way I would approach that if I were in the classroom is, look, setting your individual politics aside, if you look at the leaders who make it to the top, make it to the top of the pinnacle and sit in the Oval Office, they're all interesting people. They're all talented in some ways. They all have degrees of complexity, and they all can be different people at different times, talking about different subjects in front of different people. And so I think there's a degree of this that's not really unique to Nixon. But I've said too, he's kind of an introvert in an extrovert's profession. But when you look at his background, moving cross country and attending a law school at Duke in the South, that was a pretty different experience. Running for college president at Whittier in Southern California, that's another, sign of being an extrovert. I think just sticking your neck out for public service, I'm not sure I have the courage to do anything like that. So many times, Nixon was on the national ballot every year in this country from 1952 to 1972, with the exception of 1964. And I think he would have, if his effort had taken off, and it ultimately didn't for other reasons. And someone who was on the national stage from 46 when he was first elected to Congress, all the way until the mid 70s. So I think there are certainly moments that we would point and say he was an introvert, or moments we would say he's clearly an extrovert. But the two obviously found a way to live in relative harmony for all these years, because as you say, this was an extrovert's profession. When you had to make bold statements, when you had to say this was right or this was wrong, as the nation was going through sort of convulsive kind of social experimentation and cultural experimentation. So I look at it, authors have to give tidy labels to people, and certainly I do in my books. But I think the more that you go down the rabbit hole in terms of someone like Richard Nixon, the more complex it gets. And the longer I do this, the more that I know, I think the more that I realize I don't know and have yet to learn.
And we won't try to go into that mind, put him on the historical couch, because there are a couple of other fascinating personalities to talk about. His primary opponents, that is his general election opponents, Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. Take a few minutes to talk about each of them and what they were like.
It's these are such rich characters. It's really, all elections, I think, bring out the best and the worst in politicians and in our political system and our political parties. But there was something special about that year for another reason. As you said earlier, a president who voluntarily, Lyndon Johnson, going on television and saying he would not run in March 31st. Now, I think that's been misinterpreted as a withdrawal from politics. A withdrawal from the ballot was not a withdrawal from politics. And as I document extensively, I really restored Johnson's position in 68 to the center of the action in the election, because certainly he wanted to influence the political process and influence the choice of his successor. And then you have Hubert Humphrey, who had been on the national scene for 20 years, on the sort of northern industrial liberal wing of the Democratic Party, the former mayor of Minneapolis, who rose to fame beginning in 1948 at the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia for proclaiming civil rights as the nation's next great policy challenge, irking many of his own Democrats and causing a walkout of the Dixiecrats in Philadelphia, who would nominate their own candidate, Strom Thurmond, that year. So, Humphrey had his ups and downs. I wonder if maybe his best year in politics might not have been 1960, when he could have really focused on his core specialty of domestic policy at a less visceral time. Certainly the Johnson people said that Lyndon Johnson questions whether he had the killer instinct to be president. And I think there's a likelihood that he might have just been too nice, too decent, too honest of a guy to be in politics in the late 1960s, which was a much more visceral era, but happened to be the year that he was finally nominated as the Democrats' choice in 68. And then finally, Wallace. Initially in this research, I didn't give Wallace a lot of space. And I have to give credit to the LBJ folks that I talked to. And they encouraged me, even if it meant less space for their boss, for LBJ in the book, that I needed to treat Wallace as a full equal in the campaign. Because LBJ, they told me, considered him to be a fully fledged candidate during 68. And much of the book is through LBJ's eyes. B, because of what Wallace represented. And I think Wallace was really one of the very first times that you had someone who was completely anti-establishment in a kind of establishment, campaign. I mean, you could also look at the selection of Spiro Agnew on as Nixon's running mate. You could draw a line from there to maybe a moral majority and sort of Reagan Democrats changing sides. My own family. I grew up in households, had grandparents. There were the kind of houses that had photos of FDR on the walls and we were practicing Catholic, so Kennedy on the walls. And I have no idea how they voted. It wasn't really a political environment, but I suspect, like millions of Americans who were Union and Catholic and traditional, working class, lower middle class families, voted straight ticket Democrat, maybe crossed over during Eisenhower, went back to Johnson in 64. Might have gone for Nixon in 72, and then probably stayed, across the aisle for good as Reagan Democrats. I think this kind of sets the stage. Wallace had come to power making extreme statements on race in 62, 63, really after losing in 58 for the governorship because he did not support the Ku Klux Klan or have its endorsement. He was considered a really kind of his rhetoric was kind of, he was a demagogue, but he really was not embracing race as a ticket to become elected in 58, went all the way the other way. In 62, 63 was endorsed by the Klan, declared segregation today, tomorrow, forever as a campaign, promised to stand in the schoolhouse door to block integration in 63, which he did. And by late 60s, I think that the winds are beginning to shift. I think that we had settled the matter of civil rights. You had Civil Rights Act of 57, 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act of 68. I think it was inevitable that we were going to have civil rights, in some shape or form. And so Wallace, while he was still an important symbol for those who were concerned about race or whether the Great Society had gone too far or whether, civil rights had done too much for people who in the minds of some weren't worthy or, today probably, 10% of Wallace's support, at least, we would probably call racist. But by the late 60s, it was really more of what he stood for. And he kind of stopped talking about race and really was making anti-establishment arguments that then you can almost draw a line to the Trump years or to even the campaign of Bernie Sanders in some ways, where the kind of populist wings of both parties kind of wrap around and begin to connect, which is a strange place in the political spectrum. So I think that kind of sets the stage of really rich, interesting characters, at the top of the political system in 1968.
So again, for the benefit of youths who may be watching this, and that's a pretty broad definition, they should know that George Wallace was governor of Alabama. Actually, he was forbidden to run for re-election, and he had his wife run for governor of Alabama. She was his proxy. That happened here in Texas very famously at one point. But so George Wallace was officially a private citizen in 1968, and he created his own political party, if I remember, called the American Party. It was on the ballot, and he was a third-party candidate. Today, we would find it surprising that a Republican would not naturally win southern states. But this was a time when the Democrats, or people like Wallace, who were very conservative but still had an affinity to the Democratic Party, were in existence. And the threat that Wallace posed, well, let's talk about that. Did he threaten Nixon, the more conservative candidate, or did he threaten Humphrey, the Democratic candidate?
It's a great question. I would say he threatened both. To look at Nixon's frame of mind, you're right to point out that the South was completely controlled by Democratic parties for generations. They were basically one-party states. The Republicans, I recall, my last book on Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, when he came to the Senate in 1936, he was the only Republican to flip a Democratic seat in a complete, landslide year for FDR and the Democrats. And when he came to Washington and joined the Senate in 1937, at the time there were 17 Republicans in the Senate, 17. And I think about 5 of those weren't even real Republicans. They were kind of old, like Robert La Follette progressives, kind of prairie progressives, kind of old holdovers. And so the Republican Party, really, you could argue, wasn't even a national political party. It was really regional. It had regional issues. And I think, Lyndon Johnson almost matched the success of the Democrats against the Republicans in 1960 with the really lopsided years during those years. So, I think Wallace was a threat to both. I think Nixon decided he was not going to compete directly with Wallace because he couldn't match the rhetoric and the passion of Wallace's followers. He largely stayed out of the Deep South and instead focused on border areas in the South. And I think that kind of follows what Eisenhower did. Eisenhower was really the first Republican who showed that the South could be in play. He won Virginia both times. In 56, he even won Louisiana, which is kind of the deepest Republican penetration into the Deep South. And while Nixon couldn't match that, I think it showed that a populist enough Republican could make inroads into the South, which is ultimately what Nixon did in 1972. But in 1968, I think what Nixon saw is that Nixon was really locked into a political lane, the way I see it, that was the best lane he could have been in to begin with. So he's running as the Republican nominee. He's got Humphrey to his left. He's got Wallace running on the American Independent Party on his right. So Wallace is kind of a populist demagogue, but running on the AIP name, as you say. He's the most serious third-party challenger in 50 years, since Teddy Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party. I mean, think about what it takes. Wallace got on the ballot in all 50 states in 1968. He navigated 50 sets of state statutes, litigation, challenges from both political parties. Nobody wanted to share a ballot with George Wallace. The only place he did not get on the ballot was the District of Columbia, where it really didn't matter quite as much. That was incredible, just to get on the ballot. He was polling as high as, I believe, 23% for a period of weeks. And at a time when Hubert Humphrey was polling 28, 29. I mean, that's shocking, that was shocking to the political establishment. He ultimately ended lower. He won about 10 million votes in 1968. But especially for young people, you've seen nothing like this in recent political history. The closest we could come might be Ross Perot in the early 90s, who won enough as a third party candidate to have been, potentially decisive, in the outcome. So I think Nixon didn't want to compete with Wallace. He also didn't want to shift too much left, because then he would compete more directly with Humphrey. What Nixon wanted to be was to ride out that center lane, which was where he thought the numbers were most on his side to cross the finish line. So that was where, so he stayed out of the South. He kind of shifted, I think a lot of his campaign rhetoric looks a little more like a New York Republican, which he had been a New York Republican for about the 6 years previous to the 1968 campaign. He shifted right when it worked, and he shifted left when it worked. But I think he really sat in that lane in the middle. And one of the major themes of my Nixon class, to close the answer to the question, was rather than being the extreme figure that Nixon's often written up in history, I think at most points in his life, you can look and see that he really was a compromise figure between the conservatives to the right of him in the Republican Party, between the moderates to liberals like Rockefeller and Lodge, who were on his left in the Republican Party. And I think that's also the lane that he was in 1968.
So going in Nixon's favor in the 1968 year was all the tumult that we've been talking about, the assassinations, riots in the cities, the Vietnam War, the riot at the Democratic National Convention. So you would think that he had a lot of wind in his sails heading toward the election. And yet it was one of our closest elections. What happened?
Yeah, I think I have two reactions there. The way I read Nixon is, I think it's true in 62, Nixon being a compromise. I remember, when I was 23 years old, I was an assistant to the Speaker of the House on Capitol Hill. And I remember at the time, the House leadership was very strong for Texas. It was Dick Armey as majority leader. It was Tom DeLay as whip in the House. And I only met DeLay one time, but I recall what he said to me was, the only thing you get by being middle of the road is run over. And certainly Texans will picture all kinds of armadillos and roadkills. And I think that on the highways and byways of Texas, that certainly plays out. But politically speaking, it creates a very awkward position, because it's for someone like Nixon, the Goldwater Republicans aren't going to be enthusiastic about you, but you're good enough. For the liberal Republicans, the Rockefeller, Lodge, Eisenhower side, they're also not enthusiastic about you, but you're good enough. So you have enough wind in your sails to push you across the finish line. No one really loves you, but you're the best alternative. And this was the problem with the media's fascination of the Reagan-Rockefeller dream ticket, as it was called in 68, is because each of those sides, representing the opposite sides of the Republican Party, really didn't like each other. But yet couldn't win on their own and be nominated. The next best option was they kept falling back to Nixon, because Nixon gave enough to each side to get the votes, but didn't really command enthusiasm from any part, being a kind of true compromise. So the ultimate finish in the election, as you say, it was I guess for someone who lives in very recent years, every election is close, and where the winner oftentimes doesn't even have the popular vote. In Nixon's case, he won the popular vote by about 500,000 votes. Of course, the Electoral College, which is the thing that really matters, was much more decisive against Humphrey. And in the states where Humphrey fell short, in particular, he wasn't close enough to really close the gap. So it's one of those things where the popular vote, which certainly I think any person who watches elections recently, the popular vote might signal a different outcome than the Electoral College vote. And at least that theme of 68 is very much true to today's elections too.
Before we go to questions from the audience, I never had the chance to meet Richard Nixon. I shook hands with him once at the Manila airport when he passed through and I was in the Navy, but I never had a chance to ask him this question, which I'm now going to ask you to put yourself in Richard Nixon. He was the Republican nominee for president in 1960 against John F. Kennedy, lost very closely, and went on, as you say, to rebuild his political life. But the presidency, which he won in 1968, was colored, some would even say destroyed, by Watergate. What do you think a President Nixon who had won the 1960 election have been like versus the President Nixon we got?
What if questions in history are some of the most interesting to entertain. And of course, historians always say, it's a counterfactual. We can't talk about that because it didn't happen. Yet historians love to talk about these kinds of questions. It's really interesting, and it's so complex. I mean, I think there are easier elements to discuss and there are harder ones. I think any president who was president in the 1960s, it would have been a difficult job. We were in a divisive era, race, civil rights, an era that had already begun before the 1960s. And so Nixon was fairly moderate on those issues. And so maybe it's possible he would have found a more populist, less divisive path. But I'm not sure. It would have been pretty tough for anybody. The Vietnam, at the time, our longest war, we had personnel there in some form, probably going back during World War II. But it was really Johnson who deployed the first Marines to the beaches of Da Nang in March of 1965, and the buildup in late July, after a few months later. We'd had military personnel in Southeast Asia already doing combat-like things, even if we weren't calling them, in combat roles. I think America had a long commitment to Southeast Asia, the former French Indochina, long before the 1960s. I'm not sure, Lyndon Johnson, without a very sure footing in foreign affairs, if he'd not inherited that war, I don't think he would have gone in search of adventure in Southeast Asia. Because I say this in the book, kind of in defense of Johnson. You have to remember he did inherit a commitment that had been made before him. And so I say the same thing, if Nixon had been president in the early 60s instead. I think we had a kind of commitment there, but I don't think we would have had the big buildup that we would have had. I think Nixon was going back, he was a history major. I think he understood history and empires, and that was not the place to have a big buildup of American troops. So I think I'd point to those two examples as I don't know what he would have done, but I think it would have been a little different than what happened. I don't know, better or worse. Like Nixon during the presidency, he had a lot of ideas. Sometimes they didn't work, but he had a lot of ideas through his study of history. He was a reader. He left voluminous yellow pad notes. He did so much writing and diaries and recorded things. He was clearly a thinker, a strategist. And so I think that alone, whether he would have done the right thing or not, we would have had a little different path in the 1960s. But I think it still would have been a pretty tough, divisive period for anybody to be in that seat.
Might there have been a Watergate, which we could define as an effort to get even with the Democratic Party or otherwise protect himself politically?
I think the nation was on the path to having a Watergate for 20 years. I think it was just a matter of time before the bubble burst. Because really, while the focus has so much been on Nixon, because he was the president at the time, with more and more records being available, there are millions of pages of records dealing with Watergate today in 2022 that have never been released by the government. And, we could talk for an hour just on this. But the short version is, what we're really talking about is the battle of political power between the three branches of government, the desire to reign in the presidency, which had grown in power for many years, certainly throughout all of the 1960s under Kennedy and Johnson. And so, I think Nixon, part of what happened in Watergate was a check on presidential power, which I think would have happened no matter what, at some point, no matter who the president was. And Nixon happened to be president. So I think there was a lot of things going on during Watergate. I talk about what ifs. I like to think, what if, J. Edgar Hoover, 48-year director of the FBI, had lived another year or so? I like to think, what if Lyndon Johnson, who was a great restraining influence on Democrats during Nixon's first term, and I think, as I document in the book, had a kind of non-aggression pact with Nixon, I believe, that began in 1968 and continued through Nixon's first term. If Johnson had not died suddenly and prematurely, I would argue, at age 64 in late January 1973, if he'd lived just 6 more months or another year or two, would we have had a Watergate? And I think it's no coincidence that I think 8 days after Johnson's death, Senate Resolution 60 passes in late January 1973, which creates what becomes the Irvin Committee that investigates Watergate. And so Nixon, it's also important to note that Truman died in late 72. Nixon went through Watergate as the only current or former president. And much of the Watergate investigation was about the presidency, not just what occurred during Nixon's term in office. And while Truman or Johnson might not have defended specific actions during the Nixon administration, I think they certainly would have come to defend the presidency, the idea of taping. At the time, of course, Nixon was the only one that taped, but we've learned other presidents taped going back to 1940. So I think just, the fact that he went through it alone as the only president dramatically changed the outcome that we came to know.
Well, thank you. This has been a very fascinating discussion. I noticed that there are a couple or three questions here. So if I could look at those, get a quick question here. This is from our dean, Jim Granato, who said Nixon, like Churchill, was a prolific writer. He wrote many books that were quite prescient. In 1980, his book, The Real War, came to press. It was a reassertion of America's role in the world and how to win the Cold War. Many things he says in the book, Ronald Reagan seemed to follow. Nixon's account of China, which was just emerging from Mao's influence, is also quite amazing to read now. And so the question is, was Nixon always predisposed to this sort of scholarship?
You can hear on the tapes, Nixon was a reader. And when he had his more academic advisors, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the Oval Office, David Eisenhower, his son-in-law, was another one. They talked about, the great biographies. Have you read the latest biography of Disraeli or Churchill or de Gaulle? I think Nixon studied empires and kind of, the great men, in quotes, throughout history. Certainly, the 50 years preceding his own life. And I think he tried to actively understand kind of the world, that he was born into and ultimately rose to the top of his profession as president of the United States. So I think the question is interesting because, of course, we just can't roll up to the archives in Beijing as we can to the National Archives in this country and look at records. There's a small degree of openness, but as far as we know, there are no Mao tapes, Mao diaries, Mao yellow pads, Mao private writings. And, so when you look at as it's called, the rapprochement between the United States and the China, which is obviously a very complicated relationship then and today, obviously the Chinese wanted this and saw it in their interest as much as the Americans did. And how fascinating, I think the question also strikes at kind of the essence of history, that it's really never over because we're always learning new things that reshape what we thought we knew. And, I think I'm fascinated and tell my students that one day we could learn the Chinese side of the story, that perhaps these lifelong revolutionaries, Chairman Mao Zedong, Premier Zhou Enlai, who started the PRC in 1949, who led the Chinese Communist Party since its founding in the 1920s, might have themselves seen as a last act of revolution before they both died in 1976 to make peace with the longstanding enemy, the United States. So I think we have a lot to learn on the subject. I think the policy was already in motion under Lyndon Johnson and Nixon, perhaps like Reagan from Nixon. I think Nixon picked up a lot of ideas from Johnson that maybe he didn't have the time in office to pursue or the political will within his own party. So I think presidents, I think there is such a thing as a president's club. They borrow ideas, they look what was popular, they might shade it in a Democratic way or a Republican way, but I think policies like this do build over a long period of time.
Well, Dr. Luke Nichter, you can tell how lucky your students are at Chapman University to be able to sign up for your classes because they must be fascinating, particularly with the tapes. I presume all the tapes you're talking about are publicly accessible, the Nixon tapes and Johnson tapes, et cetera. So people can and should listen to those. As you say, they are the presidency in the raw as things happen. Any event. We thank you for your time and look forward to another conversation after your book comes out because that era is just filled and fascinating and relevant to our current time. So with thanks to our guests, let me thank you all for watching this hobby hour. Next month, We will have a member of the Houston City Council named Edward Pollard, a very fascinating fellow who came to the Houston City Council after a partial career as a professional basketball player, not in the United States, but overseas, and yet forged a very interesting and vibrant political career. So we will welcome you all to that occasion. And once again, thanks to Dr. Nichter for being with us today.
You're very welcome.
Chase
Really enjoyed
Untermeyer,
it.
and look forward to more sessions to come.